Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the InnerFight podcast. I hope you've had an incredible week, and I hope you're ready for, I think, what's an absolutely incredible show. My guest today is a gentleman called Paul Sowerby. Paul is a guy I met just a few months ago who is writing how do you put it to me? A coffee table memoir for the 60th year anniversary of my first school here in Dubai English speaking school. We sat down and literally had about a 90-minute conversation about that, and I immediately knew he would bring some great value to the show. He is a journalist, a copywriter of over 30 years. He has lived and worked in some incredible places. If you check out his website, he refers to himself as a tone of voice specialist. And there's even a link on there that says, arrange a chemistry chat, which obviously when I'm stalking people and they have things like that on their website, it interests me even more. In this show, we talk all things journalism, but also how closely related it may be to the job that a number of us do here at InnerFight. Everyone has a story. Most people want to share it, but some people don't for a number of different reasons, which Paul shares with us in this show. He also shares with us, should I ruin it? Well, it won't ruin it. How he actually has come back from the dead. Yes, you're listening correctly, and no, this isn't weird. Paul was clinically dead for 22 minutes just a few years ago. I'll leave the rest of the show for the show, but as I said, I think it's absolutely incredible. He's such a nice guy. I don't think, or I hope it's not the only time we will have him on the show. I thought this would be a great place to bring you this week's podcast announcements from. I'm in the forest in Tanzania. If you're not watching the video version, you probably should. First up, we're in the forest running Ultra X Tanzania at the moment. I've got Rob Jones in front of me, Abdul a bit behind, Adriana and Duncan. A few of us over here, back on home soil. Summer madness is still an option. If you want to get fit this summer, you need to get involved. And if that's not your jam, if you don't want to hop into classes, that's absolutely no problem. Why don't you get involved in this Simple Life project? This is 6 weeks where Rachel teaches you some really basic things that will change your life. I guarantee you. I'm out of breath. This is the hardest announcements I've done. Final Friday is also coming. End of the month. Please don't forget. Come, work out. It doesn't matter who you are or what you are, what skill level you are. If you want to fly in internationally, that's also fine. And I think, off my head, that's all this week's announcements. Let's get back to the show. This is episode number 812 of the InnerFight podcast with Paul Sowerby. Enjoy the show. Paul, thank you for being here. I know you're a very busy man, and you're actually normally on, I would say, the other side of the mic or the other side of the table. You are the one that, last time we chatted, you asked me all the questions.
I did, didn't I? Yes. I was the interviewer then. Now I feel like I'm the subject. The victim.
The victim. You've spent a lot of time in your life talking to people and asking people questions. I would say, and this might be a bit presumptuous, and I know you'll correct me if it's wrong, you're quite a curious gentleman and you like to investigate things. Would I be right?
No, you're absolutely right, actually, yes. And I'm at a loss, frankly, to know exactly where that came from. But I do know it came very early on. And when it came, I think, in the shape of an opportunity to leave boarding school in Edinburgh, and much to mum and dad's disappointment, neatly sidestep university, to take up a job as a junior reporter on a local newspaper. And I think that triggered this appetite to want to find out more about people and their stories.
I always think journalists are incredibly, like, super interesting, the amount of energy that they put into other people. You spent the last 30 plus years writing about other people. And although today we have a little bit of a topic, I want to try and uncover more about you, because you give a lot to the world. You write great articles, you write great stories. Did you ever feel that you wanted the limelight? Because you're giving everyone the limelight the whole time.
That's a very good question. I think I've seen life through the prism of other people's experiences.
Yeah.
And when you've done that for the length of time that you said, 3 and a bit decades, you do, I suppose, become conditioned to to understand how to feed that appetite for information and more knowledge. But I think that you rarely get an opportunity to tell your own story. And I think that in a lifetime that's been charmed and privileged, I think it's had many downs and a lot of amazing ups as well. I reached the point that you're sort of alluding to, which was, hang on a minute, I've told everybody else's story here. Maybe now's the time to tell my own. And I couldn't find anybody who was interested in asking me, so I just wrote the book. And I wrote the book based on a life in journalism, in sales, in marketing, in branding, in developing tone of voice and helping individuals to communicate and be the best version of themselves, which sort of condensed down to something that my far, far better wife half said to me once, and that is, you're a bullshitter, but you're actually quite a nice bullshitter. So I figured that this was something of an affliction that I needed to address. So the book itself, which was exactly what you're saying, which was me talking about me, was called "My Name's Paul and I'm a Bullshitter."
I mean,
and I have my wife to blame for that.
You were, I think your book came out in 2014.
Yeah.
Which was probably 3 or 4 years before Mark Manson brought out his book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. And that was quite aggressive, wasn't it? When we had fuck written on the cover. But even for you in 2014 to have bullshit written on the front of your book and to project yourself like that. Now, it's a funny joke between you and your wife, but talk us through that title, mate, because I'm interested in people. I often say to people, if you had a book, what would the title be? Because I think that says a lot about someone, and I don't want to say that you're absolutely full of shit, mate.
No,
but
it's a good point, actually. And I think what happened was that I realized that, and in the preface to the book, I actually take the precaution of defining bullshit for the very reason that you've pointed out. And I defined it not so much as the malicious, often hurtful, sometimes damaging mistruths that a true bullshitter might use in his armory, and more just elaborating on the truth slightly. And remember, I'd come off the back of a lifetime of making sure that you never let the truth get in the way of a good story. And it was all very gentle, and it was all very upbeat and very, very lighthearted. And it was making that very clear distinction between something that you might say, a tone of voice that you might use, which is designed to inflict willful damage on somebody, versus just fudging the edges ever so slightly.
That's a really nice segue into my sort of next question, or to a question that's popped into my mind. I'm not sure if it's changed, if the modern era is any different from how it was, but our trust of journalists at times has been a little bit wavering, mate. And sometimes I read articles in certain publications, be it anything from Huffington Post online to The Sun to The Telegraph, and think, well, this is absolute nonsense. So my question is, as a junior or just coming into the industry, and we've had a couple of encounters, I think you're a pretty honest bloke. Where do you sit with getting a good story out and letting a good story get in the way, that the phrase that you just used there. How many lies have you actually told? Where do you sit with that?
I've never told any lies, Marcus. I may have massaged the truth a little.
Brilliant.
But when in the good old bad old days of the traditional print news environment, it was, if you don't come back with a story, don't come back.
Yeah.
And you often had to be, I'd say, more creative in terms of where you go digging for stories. I vividly remember thick ears in back alleys. I vividly remember that sense of desolation that comes from knowing that somebody who's already been punished for transgressing has now got to be punished again in the public court of journalism. And that didn't really sit comfortably with me. It was an occupational hazard, I suppose. But it was tempered, I suppose, and to an extent compensated for by the fact that while there may be a sort of dark underbelly to the industry, and God knows many, many people have fallen foul of that in unjust and unjustified ways, there is also a public service involved. There is also, a need for certain transgressions to be made public. Many people who've chosen to be in the public spotlight seem to love all of the advantages, but don't accept that they're being in the public domain means they're fair game.
Yeah.
And I think that I suppose I'd sum it all up by saying that, if you are fundamentally a decent guy or girl, and you genuinely want to convey the truth in a digestible, readable, interesting, engaging format, journalism remains a tremendous career move, particularly now that the digital space has such a voracious appetite for news. In those days you were competing for column inches with major stories. And, when my mates were hanging around in pubs and clubs, I was, in the very privileged position to be out there interviewing, popes and presidents and covering wars and still hanging out in pubs and clubs. But I mean, it's all a matter of perspective, and to have that opportunity as a young man is something that I was never going to compromise by breaking all the rules and just destroying people's reputations for the sake of it. Occasionally, that was necessary, and it seems like a tremendous power that you wield. But the reality is, if somebody has broken the rules and broken the law or committed a heinous crime, then that crime should be reported. Would be the belief system that sustained me.
We'll continue for the rest of the show on the premise that you are all those great elements of a journalist, mate. And I have no...
That's very kind.
Until you publish the book, which you're working on, that I've made some comments for, and until I get to read it, I'll keep you on the good side of town. Setting out as a junior journalist or into the world, from what you said there, I guess there's maybe two different paths. You might tell me that there's a lot more than two. Interviewing someone like the Pope or a president, you've probably got something that you need to get, a story that you need to get. The other side of it is actually getting to people's stories, which I know that you're quite passionate about. And I don't know, maybe you correct me if I'm wrong, but they can be quite different. If a president is in a country for a certain reason and you're having to get something, as you said, in a column in a newspaper, that's very different from telling a story of a president's life. Would you agree?
Yes, but I'd say that, again, I can only really come back at you on that through my own personal experience. And I think that what gave me... Everybody needs a break. You need a big story. My big story was a serial killer called the Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe.
Yeah.
I was on the local paper.
Which was what?
Which was called the Harrogate Advertiser. And the Harrogate Advertiser, sadly, one of Peter Sutcliffe's victims was a Harrogate schoolgirl. That propelled me to Crown Court. That propelled me down to London to the Old Bailey for the trial because we argued successfully that we had a vested interest through a local connection, because seats on the press bench for that and many other big trials are not freely available. There's not many of them, and the big guys, the big guns, tend to get them. But we had a local connection, and I was down there, and that was, I suppose, that was my break. And I only mention that because nobody cared about Peter Sutcliffe's side of the story. He had one,
right?
But his was to do with voices from God telling him to commit crazy crimes, and so I suppose that was my baptism of fire, if you like. That was crime reporting at its very most demanding and grueling and difficult, especially for a young guy reasonably fresh into the game. So I think that I'm using him only as an example, that you're quite right. So the short answer to your question is yes, there are always two sides to the story. But sometimes people are less interested in the second side. Contrast that with some of the examples that we were talking about, where captains of industry might have achieved something quite spectacular, where there might well be a belief that somebody had achieved something, but perhaps there had been a rather more sinister underbelly to what was going on. And I think that investigative journalism at its best is all about presenting a balanced view and making sure, and I learnt this very, very early on, Marcus, making sure that you understand at all times it is not your job to be judgmental. It's your job to gather the who, why, when, what, and present the facts as they happened, not to pass opinion. And I think that was part of the reason why I kind of fell out of love with crime and news reporting, because there's very little creative latitude. It's not what you think or feel. You're not entitled to an opinion. You're simply collecting the facts and reporting them as they were told to you, which goes back to a conversation we had offline about making sure you've got all the facts, because you can imagine having one chance to come away from gathering those facts and having forgotten to ask a key question. There's no way you're going to be able to go back and say, hey mate, can we just run through that one again? Because using, say, court as an example, we would be in court, we would be reporting the court proceedings, we would run out of court to get the only payphone, and we would be phoning the story through to the copy takers from our shorthand notes. You didn't even get a chance to write the story. So woe betide you if you got any of your facts wrong. So it's a fact collection, regurgitation exercise, which is fine and quite, I'm going to say glamorous in one sense anyway. But it was when I got an opportunity to move into feature articles, where you're entitled to have an opinion and you're entitled to share that opinion, that it really starts to get quite sexy.
That's another great segue. You're obviously quite good at this, mate, because you've been on the other side of the table a lot. And this is sort of typical because you're a good journalist, so you know how to answer questions in a roundabout way and not another. I want to loop back as well with this to the start. What fuels this? How do you get so excited about this next step that you just spoke about there? You're going away from crime and you're moving into something that you are allowed some creative landscape, some opinion, and to how we connected. It struck me how you were so excited to talk to me about my school days of 30 plus years ago. Where does that excitement start?
I think it probably comes, it began with a love of words.
Right.
From a very early age. We all find things difficult in life. Some things difficult in life, and God knows I do. But writing something I've always found easy. It has never ceased to amaze me that I'm juggling the same 26 letters around that everybody has access to, and I just seem to get them to land in the right place. And I've never taken for granted the fact that when you're working in the freelance space, people are prepared to pay you to do that. I mean, this is like a utopian concept to me. So I think, to answer your question, first of all, it came from a love of words. From then came a love of the sound of words. And I think that when you combine those two, you end up with quite a heady cocktail, really, because I love using words and I like hearing words. And there aren't many opportunities in life to hear a load of words and then to use your, I'm going to say command, but understanding of how words put together to then represent what that individual feels and thinks and says in a way that, quite often they might not be able to communicate themselves, which interestingly took me into, first of all, that creative latitude that I craved, took me out of news and into feature writing, where I got an opportunity to write about the things that I was passionate about. I was a motoring correspondent. I was a cinema correspondent. All of the things that I was passionate about and felt I had opinion on, I got an opportunity to write about. So I was indulging a passion all the way along. From there, I realized that real latitude, real creative space existed outside mainstream journalism, working with individuals and organizations who needed to tell their story. And I realized that going through essay writing to crime, to car reviews, to cinema reports, where I was really heading was inexorably towards a position where I could be a storyteller. And when I got there, the penny dropped that was my first love, that I love nothing more than hearing words, so listening to people's stories, and then sharing those stories as a storyteller. And when you've got those two fundamental drivers stitched into your DNA, which I think I have, I can't get enough of people's stories. And I just love listening to people who are passionate about what they've done, who want to be the best version of themselves, and who want to communicate better. And I think that spending time with them is my sort of my ambrosia. That's how I get. We all have to spend time with negative people. I'm afraid it happens. They're all around us, and I'm no different from anybody else. But I make a point, pardon me, of gravitating towards people who are positive. And I think the energy that people who are positive exude helps me to tell their story much more effectively.
Is part of the challenge to unlock something in someone? Because you said something really interesting there that, and I might mess it up, so excuse me if I do, but you said something along the lines of you're able to ask these questions and tell this story and present it in a way that it resonates with the person, but they never knew that they were telling it like that. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think that the way that has manifested itself to me is in and out of journalism, but mainly since mainstream journalism, where I've been able to pick and choose, sounds awfully grand and probably not entirely accurate, but exercise some influence over who I speak to. And when you have that ability to almost cherry pick the individuals that you speak to, there's only one potential limitation. And that is, what if they either don't want to share their story, or what if they just can't get it all out? And the first challenge is a tricky one, because they may have very good reasons for not wanting to share their story. They could be personal, they could be professional, they could be financial, they could be because they fear inflicting injury on somebody else or hurt. And there's not much you can do about those. But there are a lot of instances when people desperately want to tell their story. It's all in there. And your job is to tease it out of them. And that happens more often, would you believe, than not. So the vast majority, since I moved into what I would call commercial writing, where I never quite know whether you've become a poacher or a gamekeeper, but one way around, I've never really, it's a fascinating dynamic when you're suddenly working with people who have a story to tell. They kind of want to tell it. They're even prepared to pay you to tell it for them, but they just can't get it out. It's in there, but you can't get it out. And however hard you try, they still just can't explain what it is that they truly want to say. And if I could tell you with hand on heart that I'm sitting here today with the silver bullet that fixes that, well, I'd be in a different financial situation.
How did you know that was my next question?
Because getting people to do that, it's attrition, Marcus. You grind them down. You put them in a very psychologically safe space. Most of the time, I've found, having done it God knows how many times, most of the times you encounter people who struggle to tell you their story, it's because they don't feel they're in a psychologically safe space. They don't feel confident that telling their story to ostensibly a complete stranger is going to be something that is going to make them feel uncomfortable, perhaps, is going to come back and bite them later in life, is going to not be cathartic, but is actually going to make them even more stressful. So if you can create a psychologically safe space, and I'm coming across like a psych now, and I'm certainly wouldn't ever want to do that. But I think that if you can make people relax, let's say.
How?
Well,
how do you do it? What is your silver bullet, mate? What's some of the tools? Because there's people listening that a lot of this is resonating, whether they're on your side of the table or the other person's side of the table. And I think for a lot of people, we want to be heard. We genuinely want to be heard. We want our stories to be told, but we haven't, you've said it in a number of different ways so far, we haven't reached a point where we have the confidence to let it out. And we know, and it's the same for what we do here. People will walk into the gym and they'll give us half the story. Why? Because they're maybe a bit embarrassed. They're just not quite ready. And what we're trying to do within the gym is we're trying to create this safe space. Because the push-ups are the push-ups, the squats, the running, it could be anything. What we're trying to do, there's a block somewhere. There's a block to physical exercise and there's a block for someone's ability to share their story with you. And that's what I'm trying to contrast and compare here, how we unlock people, because nothing changes. The workout doesn't change that much. Yeah, the order we put it in, the music we put on, we can change the environment. But 3 months or 6 months, and like you said, it's a war of attrition, right? You grind them down. You keep going back and asking them more questions. And we're doing kind of the same thing. And then suddenly things start to click, things start to change, and they're able to achieve greater things than they've ever been able to achieve. So I think it's similar.
It's strikingly similar. And so similar that I have a suspicion that my golden key could be of use to you.
This is why I want it.
And I think at the risk of sounding flippant, there are striking similarities. And I've got to say that they hadn't struck me until you just said what you've just said. I think that people who come to you and some of your amazing trainers will see positive individuals oozing vitality, oozing positivity, ripped quite often, looking great, feeling great, optimum nutrition, just looking like, they get it. And I think that people can sometimes struggle to associate with that. They may aspire to look and feel the same way, but when they walk through that door for the first time, it can be a little intimidating. And I think when people sit down with me to talk about their story, and they are no more or less willing to sit down with me and talk than they are to walk through the front door of your gym. 100%. It's the same thing. We haven't dragged them kicking and screaming there. They've come of their own accord. I think when they sit down with me, they quite often, in fact, more often than not, I would say, have checked me out. They've Googled your guys and you, and they've read about this amazing guy with an achievement-packed life. And for me, they've seen that I've been a journalist for 30 years, that I've been a captain of industry, that I've won awards for my writing, and they can find that a little intimidating. And I think that's why the one thing that has always worked for me as a starting point is apparent empathy. So what I tend to do is to immediately make it very clear that I've done a lot of things wrong. I've many times in my life have been suboptimal. I have made rookie errors in the way I've reported stuff, the way I have conducted my life. I tell them I died. And bouncing, you think you're having a tough gig, try bouncing back from the dead. And I just wonder if part of what makes your business and your PT so successful is that either consciously or subconsciously, part of the gig is dumbing it all down a bit and making them feel like they're limited only by their imagination and their commitment to making change in their physique, in their diet, in their nutrition, in their mindset, in their mental wellness. And I just think that apparent empathy wins the day, hands down for me. I do a bit of role reversal, and I don't just think it, I tell them about it. And you can immediately see people feeling at ease. And I just think that people walk through your front door and can be greeted by people who are prepared to sit down and talk to them about how they once were in their life and how small incremental changes have got them to the point that they're at. I have a suspicion that in just the same way you've put those people at ease, they're more comfortable coming back, and they're more comfortable, in my case, opening up to me.
I agree.
Well, I didn't think you wouldn't, because you have a gig here which has got to be based on making people feel comfortable. You'll get them through the door once. You've got to get them to keep coming back. Yeah,
and I think when it's the same. It's incredible, actually. The more we talk and maybe process these things, how close our roles are, which I think when you first contacted me for the book, and a little bit of background, which I spoke about in the introduction, Paul is writing it's evolving, right? But basically a 60th year anniversary book of one of the first schools that I went to after nursery school here in Dubai, the DES, Dubai English Speaking School, and that will be out sometime. But yeah, when you first contacted me, did I think that we were that closely matched as roles? No, but what you're doing, we're essentially both helping people to express themselves in a world that people want to express themselves for a number of different reasons, either for their personal reasons or sadly sometimes for more external reasons. You're doing it with words, we're doing it with exercise.
Yeah.
It's nuts. You said something there, and I think you've said it twice now. You nearly weren't here. If things would have happened a little bit differently, if they hadn't have tried just one more time, the game of squash would have been the last game. Talk us through that, if you feel comfortable to do so.
Yeah, death sucks. I would not recommend it. February the 23rd, 2020 was just like any other Sunday, at least for the first couple of hours of the day. And yeah, I would ordinarily have been diving into my own fitness regime, which for me, I'd become obsessed by spin cycling. So it was an hour's spinning before some weights and all the normal stuff. And my eldest daughter had somebody, she'd booked 2 squash courts and had asked me if I wanted to make up a 4. She had a friend from university and her lovely boyfriend Jake, and and the friend from university was a squash coach, and she'd asked me if I wanted to, as I say, come along and play. So I thought, well, I played squash 30 years ago. I can whoop a young 30-year-old coach. So off I went, and bear in mind, I was pretty fit, but not as fit as I thought. We were playing the game with the 30-year-old squash coach, or at least, it was a game for me. It wasn't so much a game for him. And then we switched courts, and I was playing with daughter Sophie. She didn't know the rules of squash, but has been an elite athlete herself in her life, playing water polo, and so she's keen to learn new sports, and squash was one of them. So I was explaining to her the rules, bent down to pick the squash ball up, and then bang. They call it. They give it a fancy name. It's called an out-of-hospital sudden cardiac arrest. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I did subsequently, that they give it that fancy name because so few people survive it. There's really no need to know what to say. And I hadn't realized that the so few was 8%. So 8% of the people who have a cardiac arrest suddenly, i.e. with no preceding heart attack, just straight to the main course, out of hospital, die. And I was one of them. You hit the ground dead. And it's pretty horrendous unless you've got somebody around you who can move reasonably quickly to do some CPR, and in my case to go and get the defibrillator in the gym. So darling Sophie, my daughter, ran off, got the defibrillator, got the manager, instructed her boyfriend to start CPR, and he hadn't done it before, but he's a big, strong boy, so off he went. And the whole thing of running around and managing to get the defibrillator and the CPR was done in what seemed like record speed, 10 minutes, I think. And it took that long for the paramedics to arrive. And in that time, they tried to shock me with the squash club's own defibrillator. Jake, bless him, smashed his way through 4 ribs doing CPR, and obviously thinking, well, the old bugger's not going to die on my watch. But they couldn't bring me back. I remained clinically dead. The paramedics arrived and did what they do with their industrial strength gear, and spent another 12 minutes, so their records say, trying to resuscitate me. And it was really only right at the very end when my far better half came screeching in on 2 wheels, telling everybody that he's not going to die today, that they tried one more time. And apparently, on the very last attempt, just as they were beginning to think, well, we may as well pack up and give up on this one, he's not coming back. I did. I came back, and that would be, the records say, 22 minutes of clinical death. Now, ordinarily, you don't survive. You certainly don't survive 22 minutes without serious neurological impairment. But it wasn't my turn that day. He wasn't ready for me, and I managed to get bundled into an ambulance. By that point, it was like an episode of Hawaii Five-0 outside the squash club. I think police helicopters had arrived. It was a school squash court, so the school was out to watch. And they got me off to the coronary intensive care unit and did whatever they do. And I got through it. And I think that surviving it seemed pretty straightforward to me. What I didn't know was the journey that lay ahead. So it was like I said, it's not something I'd recommend. It's far more grim, I think, for the people around you who love you. And you would never want your daughter to see you go through anything like that. But she did, and I'm here talking to you.
It's still quite fresh. We're just over 3 years. Do you notice any big changes in your life? About the way that you do things, about maybe the way that you do the amazing job that you do in telling people's stories even?
I think the biggest change, and it's interesting that I spent a lot of time, as we've talked about, helping people to communicate, helping people with the voice and the words that they use to communicate. And I think that I call that tone of voice. And I think that tone of voice, you can never tick it off your list. I think it's a movable feast. You can never count it as being done, because I think the way in which you communicate and I think your tone of voice is a window into your character. And I think that as you evolve as an individual, and as you go through life and experience life's traumas and tribulations, I think you change, and I think the way you communicate and your tone of voice changes. And if I had been in any doubt about that, then my own experience would prove that you really do continue to evolve. And I got to a point where, when it happened, to answer your question, when it happened, I think I'd got to the top of my ladder. It wasn't a huge ladder, but it was my ladder. I'd got to the top of my fitness ladder. I was very fit, and in hindsight, the consultant medics who fondly call me a freak say, you probably survived because you were so fit. I'd got to the top of the corporate ladder. At that point, I was managing communications for large organizations around the world, and I was kicking all the goals. So I think that I'd become a little bit arrogant. I think I had become a little bit complacent. I think I had probably lost sight of some of the things that really matter in life. And I'd become a little bit too tolerant of mediocrity in myself, in my environment, and in terms of other people. So I suppose, to get to the nub of the answer in terms of change, I can only talk through the prism of my own experience. I realized that I was, first and foremost, people told me I was incredibly lucky. My perspective on that at first was, well, I'm not that lucky. It needn't have happened in the first place. I realized that I was alive and I'd been given a second chance, and I tried to work out what that second chance was for. What am I supposed to do with it? I very quickly realized that I was angry. I couldn't understand why this had happened at this particular stage in my life. So just to get back to the point that I really would like to make, I reached a critical point in my development where I realized I had to reinvent that tone of voice. I had to redefine how I was going to get through this low point in my life and how I was going to bounce back. And I had two choices. I could either remain angry and I could bounce back bitter, or I could bounce back better. I could either come to terms with the fact that there were certain things in life I couldn't control, and I'd just come across one, which was a bit tricky for me as a bit of a control freak. But there were things, after all, that are beyond my control. I knew that I had not perhaps invested the right amount of time in the relationships that really mattered. So I focused on relationships, and I focused also on my environment. And I realized that I was the contributor to the cardiac arrest was probably stress, and the stress had come from a working environment that didn't sustain me and didn't feel right. It was toxic, and I tried to make it better. And what I should have done is acknowledge the fact that if you're in a toxic environment, you need to change it, and you need to keep changing it until it's right for you. And when I put all those together one day, the controlling only the controllables, getting to grips with your attitude, bouncing back, better, not bitter, managing the relationships that really matter and investing more in them, and concentrating on your environment, I had CARE, and I called it care. And you know what? When it dawned on me that, and I talked to a few people about care, and when it dawned on me that they were actually nodding while I was speaking to them, and probably boring the pants off them, it made me realize that I had been through a fairly seismic shift that had been imposed on me, but that, wouldn't it be great if we could all just sit down quietly and evaluate where we'd got to in life, whether aspects of our life were optimized or suboptimal, whether or not we were actually our direction of travel was what we really wanted. Maybe we should all sit down and take care. Maybe we should work out what it is that we really want to control and, not sweat the stuff that doesn't matter. Maybe we should all think about, is our attitude right? The relationships that matter to us, are we investing well enough in them? And are we in an environment at work, at home, in relationships that doesn't sustain us anymore? And if so, let's change it. Because I had a salutary lesson that you don't get a second chance usually. And having been given one, the one thing I did know when I was trying to work my way through this horrendous fight back was I've got to do something with this second chance. And I just wonder, Marcus, if I would have done any of that if I hadn't been forced to do it.
It's a tricky one, isn't it? Because we often hear that tragedy causes change, sometimes positive, sometimes not so positive. But is that the tipping point in life? And how could we perhaps create that tipping point in life for change? Like, how would life have played out?
Yep.
You said you were comfortable in certain ways and all of the other stuff. How can we create that for people without having to be dead for 22 minutes and not only the stress that's put you under, but the stress that's put, your daughter, your lovely wife, the medical services, all of that under. What I'm hearing a lot here is, and this concept, it might be new to some people, it might not be, but it's almost the opposite of post-traumatic stress disorder. It's post-traumatic growth, which is, you do have this time where I think it's natural, and maybe you went through it a little bit, of a victim mindset, like just trying to box off why it happened to me. And I always say this to people, and it's probably, I'm trying to connect some dots here, but it might be linked to the fact that you are a journalist and you're used to asking people questions and actually not getting the answers. Because in times of tragedy, we have a lot of questions, but in those times, they don't always get answered for us because there's no reason. And you have to come to peace with something that you said as well, that it happened, and that's part of my journey. So maybe journalism was preparing you to not have answers to the questions that you had.
I think it's certainly given me access to a set of tools, which has enabled me to effect change on me, but also help other people. These medics that I said were fondly calling me a freak, asked the freak if I would help other people who'd been much less fortunate. Obviously, I wasn't able to help those that didn't make it, but some people who had survived heart attacks, cardiac arrests, and who had done really quite badly in terms of not just the physiological. I mean, bones get fixed, ribs get fixed. When you're dead before you hit the floor, so you don't put your arms out. So I landed on my shoulder, ripped my shoulder to pieces. All fixable. The emotional and the physiological and the psychological damage and the recovery that's needed are by far and away the biggest ones. And I had totally overlooked those. So the point I'm trying to make is that you're absolutely right, that I felt that I needed to do something, not only with the second chance, but with the toolkit that I had at my disposal. So when they said, would I be prepared to help other people? What they meant was, where individuals had been through something less traumatic, but similar, would I be prepared to talk them through it? Would I be prepared to help them deal with the physiological journey that they were on, particularly those who were in a really, really bad way? And I obviously said, unquestionably yes, and I did, and I have. And the British Heart Foundation got hold of me and they said, I understand you're prepared to help us. We've got a series of programs going out, and we've also got individuals that they just need help. And I talked to them, and I used care. I just said to them, look, I know what you're going through. Apparent empathy. Here we go again. They didn't want to talk about it, many of them. They knew it was inside them, and what they really wanted to do was to try and share how they were feeling, but they couldn't get it out. Well, apparent empathy, I was able to say, I've been there. I know how you're feeling. And let me tell you, what you're feeling right now is not like what you're about to feel. But let me tell you how you're going to get through it. And just by sharing that with them, I think I was able to put something back in. But the point of the answer to your question is, yes, I think you're absolutely right, that not only was I inclined to help, but I had a toolkit that enabled me to. And I think that was hopefully to the enduring benefit of those people that I got a chance to speak to. But it was good for me as well, because from a philanthropic point of view, I was able to put something back in. And maybe that's part of the answer to what I'm supposed to do with this second chance.
I think that's where my mind's going on it fast, is you're able to heal through helping, and you're able to help through healing. And they go in this crazy way, hand in hand.
I think you're doing a remarkable job of saying what I'm trying to get out. So maybe I'm struggling with it a bit as well.
Well, your words, your written words, and maybe I'm spoken words. We need to. I have a question, and this is something that I only learned quite recently when I was being asked the question on someone else's podcast. And I never knew it existed before. There's a term, near-death experience, and certain things happen or are spoken of happening when you have a near-death experience. And when I was asked about it on the show, it actually blew me away, and I lost it for a little while because everything sort of came back. Do you have any vivid memories of which are odd or sound weird? And maybe this is, again, for my own satisfaction and for my own therapy, of those 22 minutes where you were clinically dead. Do you remember were you anywhere?
No, it is probably one of the most common questions that I've been asked, both in terms of just genuine curiosity and, dinner time chat. So come on, what's it like? What did you feel? And what color was the light? And was the guy at the end of the bed with the crooked finger beckoning you, and you just said, I'm not coming just yet? No, I'm afraid not. Really? Most disappointingly, nobody was there with 6 numbers for Saturday night and said, look, if you put these numbers on, you're going to be in a really good shape. No, there were no, I can't honestly say with hand on heart that there were any near-death experiences. Now, I don't know, and I really don't know, I don't know whether that could be in any way connected to the fact that I'd gone rather than nearly gone. Because I've since taken a huge interest in what happens physiologically when it hits the fan. And when you are dying, perhaps horrendous subject to be talking about, but drowning, when you are having a heart attack and slipping into an arrest, which of course most people think people die of heart attacks. You don't really die of a heart attack. You die when you arrest.
Yes.
And the heart attack is the precursor to that. Plumbing and electrics marry together, and that's not a great cocktail. I didn't have that. Mine was purely electrical. It was an electrical failure. It was a short circuit. Right. And I think so I never went through a period where I was dying. I only went, I died. And I can't give you anything that is either that even sounds correct spiritually, medically, psychologically, that makes any more sense to me than it probably does to anybody listening. But that's the only thing that I can think, is that because I was dead and then brought back, there was no middle ground.
There's no dying.
There was no dying, no. And I think that I don't know. I was going to say, I don't know whether I feel robbed, but I certainly do in terms of the 6 numbers. But no, I don't. And everybody wants to know. And I secretly wish I could have brought something back that would have put people at ease.
Has it changed your outlook and approach to death?
Well, that's a very, very good question. And I'll tell you why. Because I have, and the best way I can answer that as succinctly as possible is to tell you how I am now. And how I am now is back to, as near as damn it, peak fitness. And I say as near as damn it because I'm medically enhanced, chemically enhanced. I have, I wouldn't say a onerous cocktail of drugs, but there are things that you just have to accept, you just have to take. So you have to keep your blood thin. You have to make sure your blood pressure doesn't go off the clock, and you have to just slow everything down. You have to remove adrenaline. And the only way you can remove adrenaline, as you know, is to block it. And that's what beta blockers do. So apart from the whole cholesterol shenanigans, those are the 3 drugs that I need to take to make sure that I am optimized in terms of addressing the likelihood of it happening again. Right. So that's part 1 of the answer, and I'll stitch all these together in a minute. The second part is, I said to the medics, so is this going to happen again? When they told me they didn't know why it had in the first place. And they said, yeah, it could. So I said, great, have I got anything to look forward to? And they said, oh, yeah, we're going to give you your own defibrillator. So I said, well, do I carry it around in a rucksack? How's this going to work? Does it have to go everywhere with me? They said, no, it's all right. We're going to stitch it into your chest. So this, it's called an ICD, and it's matchbox size, and it packs a punch. So it's an industrial strength, not the one that you might find in the gym, but the one that the paramedics use. And it's an industrial strength defibrillator packed with juice. And it's implanted in your chest, in your shoulder. And it sits there in a pocket with a wire into your heart. And the idea is that it's permanently monitoring what your heart's doing. And if your heart starts to go too quickly, tachycardia is my issue, not bradycardia, which is too slow. And for that, you obviously have pacemakers. It shocks me. And it hasn't yet, by the way, because it's like a very big kick from
I'm thinking where the button is and just to zap you.
Yes, but that's just the weird person that you are. Yeah. It's industrial strength. You don't want it to go off because it's a big kick from a big donkey. And I obviously hope it doesn't go off on the way back from the bar with a tray of drinks. That wouldn't be great. But apparently, and it talks to this, and I won't waste too much time on this, but it's important that it talks to a gadget, a box that sits next to the bed. And the box, at midnight every night, asks the ICD in my chest what sort of a day my heart has had. And my ICD obviously says, great, it went up a bit when he was in the gym, but other than that, he's fine. And everybody's happy. If it should happen to say, well, actually, we had a bit of a funny turn earlier, we don't quite know whether it was a funny turn or whether he was running for a taxi, but it was a funny turn, I get a phone call from a clinic in Leeds in the UK asking me if I'm okay. Wow. And it's a very, very clever sense of reassurance that this thing, if I have another cardiac arrest, is going to fire up to 8 times. And when I asked the obvious question, like, well, so what if it hasn't worked after 8 times? The answer was, I suppose, pretty obvious, and that is you won't need it anymore. Yeah. So there is that. Yeah. So I have medication. I've got a device in my chest. And I've also got a condition called atrial fibrillation, which is where my heart doesn't beat anymore. It just wobbles like a jelly. And elite athletes who do crazy things like Marathon des Sables and 30 marathons in 30 days, people, crazy people from a different planet. It's not unheard of for them to have atrial fibrillation because they're constantly putting the heart under pressure and eventually it gets a bit confused. That's paroxysmal. It happens from time to time. Mine's permanent. So I'm left with a fibrillating heart rather than a beating heart. And there is a higher stroke risk that comes with that because blood can pool because it's not beating properly. So the answer to your question is changed, yes. Physiologically, I've changed. I've got to be medicated. I've got a gadget next to the bed and one in my chest. And I've got this weird quivering heart. But I don't think I fear death because, well, I've been there and it didn't take me that time. I think it's left me a little bit stoical and a little bit philosophical in that when it's my time, it really will be my time. But I think what it has done, it's made me, at the risk of sounding, a a bit naff. It's just put a far higher price tag on vitality, on the relationships that I'm privileged to have, and on the fact that every minute has to count. So the big change is in terms of the physiology, but for me the most lasting change is I don't waste a minute of the day now. I cannot believe that there have been times in my life when I've said, actually, I'll just kill time for a while. You will never, ever find me killing time.
We could talk all day, but that is a hell of a way to wrap it up, mate. I genuinely have more questions, but it can't get better. If that's one thing that anyone can take from the last hour, I think that's the best part. You can help people to find their voice. You can help people's tone of voice. But at the end of the day, I think you can help people in that way that every minute really does count. Mate, I really appreciate it. I'm going to put all the links. I have notes for days here and, arrange a chemistry chat on my website. Like, what's that all about was one of my questions. But folks, hop over paulsowerby.com. I will link it in the show notes. Paul, I really appreciate your energy, your time, your insights, and for giving up a lot of energy for me. I appreciate it.
Anytime, Marcus. Thank you.
Thank you.